It started in a small, quiet village surrounded by tall green hills. The place was peaceful, the kind of area where time moved slowly and people knew every neighbor by name. The villagers had lived there for generations, farming the land, tending to their animals, and following the same rhythm their ancestors had set long ago. Far beyond the last cluster of houses, the hills curved into a wide valley. From above, it looked like a cradle made by the earth itself. At its center stood a mound that looked like a sleeping giant's shoulder, large, oddly shaped, and covered with thick grass and stones. The locals called it the Resting One. They believed it was sacred ground, and children were told not to play near it. No one ever farmed that patch of land, even though it was rich and green. The old people said it was better to leave it undisturbed. Then one year, a group of geologists and engineers arrived. They came with modern equipment, heavy trucks, and rolled up blueprints. Their goal was to test the ground for a new water project, something the government planned to build to store mountain runoff and supply nearby cities. The officials promised it would bring jobs, better roads, and development. To the villagers, that sounded like a miracle. But when the team said they wanted to drill near the Resting One, the smiles on the villagers' faces faded. The village head, an elderly man with deep lines on his face, warned them gently. He told them, "That hill is not just land, it sleeps. You shouldn't disturb it." The engineers exchanged polite glances, trying not to laugh. They were used to hearing such stories in rural areas, old legends mixed with fear of change. They promised to be careful, and the work began. The first few days went smoothly. The team set up their base camp near the foot of the hill. They planted sensors, tested soil samples, and marked spots for drilling. The machines hummed day and night. To the villagers, it felt strange to hear the constant buzzing in a place that had always been silent. A few of them would gather in the evenings near the camp to watch, curious but uneasy. Then one night, something odd happened. Around midnight, one of the field assistants noticed the ground vibrating under his feet. It wasn't strong, more like the faint pulse of a heartbeat deep underground. He checked his instruments, but they showed nothing unusual. He assumed it was just wind or the echo of distant thunder and went back to work. The next morning, they found one of the sensors had stopped recording. It had overheated during the night for no clear reason. The technicians replaced it, thinking it was just a fault. But over the next few days, the same thing happened again and again. Small malfunctions, strange readings, and soft tremors that no one could explain. At first, the engineers joked about it. They said maybe the mountain didn't like their machines. But by the end of the week, even they couldn't ignore that something felt strange. The ground under the hill was not behaving like normal soil or rock. It was too solid, too uniform. When they tried to drill deeper, the bit struck something that wasn't stone, yet it refused to break. They brought in stronger tools and began to dig manually around the drilling spot. A few meters down, they uncovered what looked like a smooth surface, almost like carved stone, but much larger than any natural formation. The texture was odd, too. Not exactly man-made, not entirely natural. The team gathered around it, brushing off dirt and mud, trying to figure out what it was. One of the workers said it looked like part of an old monument buried long ago. Another laughed and said it was probably an ancient temple, but the lead geologist disagreed. The shape was too organic, too lifelike. The lines looked like veins, the surface like hardened skin. That evening, the villagers came again. They watched from a distance as the team worked under bright floodlights. The light reflected off the half-buried structure, making it glimmer faintly. An older woman whispered something to her granddaughter, words that sounded like a prayer. The little girl clutched her hand tightly and wouldn't look away. The next morning, when the sun rose, a group of villagers came to the camp. They brought food as a gesture of kindness, but also wanted to speak with the engineers. One of them said, "We've lived here all our lives. Our grandparents told us this land is not just earth. Something lives under it, something that sleeps. If you disturb it, the hills will shake." The project manager smiled politely and assured them nothing was wrong. He showed them the equipment and explained how it worked, talking about science and data and stability. The villagers listened silently. They didn't understand much of the technical talk, but they could see the nervous glances between some of the younger team members. Later that day, one of the geologists went into the village alone. She was younger than the rest, quiet and observant. She sat with the old village head and asked him to tell her the story again, about the Resting One. The old man took a deep breath and began. He said long ago, Before the village even existed, the valley had been home to something ancient, a protector of the earth. But when people became greedy and dug too deep, the protector grew angry. The land cracked, rivers dried, and the mountains shook. To calm it, the ancestors performed rituals and sealed the being beneath layers of stone and soil, promising never to disturb its rest again. "We thought it was just a story," he said softly, "but every legend starts with truth." The young geologist didn't know what to say. She didn't believe in myths, yet she couldn't deny that something about this place felt alive. The air was thick and heavy, and at night, she could feel faint tremors through her tent floor. Slow, rhythmic, like the pulse of a massive heart beneath the ground. One evening, as she sat outside alone, she noticed the sound of the insects and night birds fading away. The air grew still, almost expectant. Then came a low rumble, not loud but deep enough to vibrate in her chest. The lights from the camp flickered for a moment, and a few tools fell from the table. When it stopped, everyone came out of their tents looking confused. The ground had shifted slightly, but not enough to cause panic. The next morning, a thin crack appeared near their drilling site. It stretched in a straight line, several meters long, cutting through the soil as if drawn by a knife. The workers tried to fill it in, but by evening it opened again. The ground seemed to be rejecting their effort to close it. Word spread through the village quickly. The elders came again, this time more insistent. They begged the team to stop and pack up before something worse happened. The engineers were torn. Half of them wanted to continue, determined to find a logical explanation. The other half wanted to pause and reevaluate. But the project had deadlines and the sponsors were expecting progress reports. So they decided to continue for one more week. They reinforced their drilling equipment and ignored the uneasy silence that had settled over the valley. That night, the young geologist couldn't sleep. She lay awake, listening to the faint hum under the earth. It was steady now, more defined. She got up quietly and walked to the edge of the site, holding her flashlight low. The beam landed on the exposed surface they had uncovered, and for a second she thought she saw it move. It wasn't much, just a faint ripple across the stone like a slow breath. She blinked, thinking it was her imagination. The next morning she told the others, but they laughed it off. They said she was exhausted and imagining things. Yet as the day went on, everyone noticed something new. The readings from their instruments were changing rapidly. The vibrations were stronger and strangely rhythmic. It didn't look like normal seismic activity at all. Still, they continued, pretending everything was fine. The machines kept digging and the villagers kept watching, shaking their heads. No one noticed that the birds had completely stopped returning to the valley. Even the air smelled different now, thicker, with a hint of something metallic. That evening, as the sun went down behind the hills, the young geologist wrote in her field journal, her hand trembling slightly. She wrote, "Something beneath us is moving. It's not just rock. It's not just ground, it feels alive." And as darkness covered the valley once more, the faint hum returned, low, steady, and patient, like something enormous stirring in its sleep far beneath the earth. Days passed, and the team continued their work, pretending that nothing unusual was happening. But deep down, everyone could feel it. Something wasn't right. The ground beneath their feet had started to change. It didn't feel steady anymore. Sometimes when they stood still, they could sense a faint vibration, like the earth had a slow heartbeat. Every morning, the team would check their instruments and find strange readings. The seismographs showed soft, rhythmic pulses instead of random tremors. They didn't match any known pattern of natural movement. The data looked alive, steady, breathing, and strangely deliberate. Some of the younger members joked that the mountain was snoring, but no one really laughed. The air around the site had grown heavy, filled with tension that no one wanted to admit. One afternoon, a loud metallic sound echoed from the drill site. The crew ran toward it and saw that the main drill had jammed again. The bit had struck something solid, too solid for ordinary rock. When they tried to restart the machine, the motor burned out completely. Smoke rose from the engine and a strange smell filled the air, like hot metal mixed with wet clay. The project head ordered everyone to stop for the day. As the workers stepped back, they noticed the ground around the drilling hole had changed color. It wasn't dark brown anymore. It had turned grayish, almost like stone dust. When they touched it, it felt warm, not from sunlight, but from deep inside the ground. That night, they gathered near the campfire, trying to make sense of it. Someone suggested it was an underground volcanic area, but the region had no record of volcanic activity. Another person thought it might be gas pockets heating the soil, but then one of the technicians, who had grown up in a nearby town, spoke softly. "My grandmother used to say the earth breathes before it wakes." His voice trembled slightly as he said it. The others looked at him but said nothing. They didn't want to talk about superstitions again. But even in silence, everyone was thinking the same thing. Maybe the villagers were right. That night was restless. The wind was strong, and strange sounds carried through the valley. It wasn't quite thunder. It wasn't rock falling either. It was deeper, like the slow shifting of something huge beneath the ground. The tents rattled and the camp's lights flickered for a few seconds before stabilizing again. The young geologist, the same one who had listened to the elder's story earlier, stepped outside her tent with her notebook in hand. She wanted to see if the vibrations matched her previous data. When she placed her hand on the ground, she could feel the faint pulse again, slower now but stronger than before. She began to write. The earth moves in intervals, not randomly. It feels alive but calm, like something stirring, not shaking. The next morning, she showed her notes to the project head. He smiled politely but didn't say much. He had already received calls from his superiors asking for progress. The project was costing money every day it didn't move forward. "Let's stay focused," he said. "We'll double-check our data, fix the machines, and continue tomorrow." But not everyone agreed. One of the senior field workers wanted to leave. "Sir, I've worked on dozens of sites," he said firmly. "But I've never seen a place behave like this. The ground shouldn't be warm. It shouldn't move like this." His voice was steady but filled with quiet fear. The manager dismissed him gently, reminding him of their duty and deadlines. So, the work went on. Later that afternoon, the team started drilling again, this time a few meters away from the first site. As soon as the drill touched the ground, it began to shake violently, and the bit snapped within seconds. The sound that came from below was not metallic this time. It was a low, deep groan that seemed to roll through the valley like thunder trapped underground. Everyone froze. The sound lasted only a few moments, but it left everyone speechless. Even the birds in the nearby trees flew off in every direction. The villagers, who had been watching from afar, started murmuring prayers and walking back toward their homes. The old stories were coming alive before their eyes. The geologists stood in silence, unsure what to do. One of them picked up a handful of soil and noticed it was trembling ever so slightly, as if something below was moving, breathing, or trying to rise. That evening, they held a meeting in the camp's main tent. The project head tried to stay calm, saying it was probably an underground gas shift or trapped air escaping. But deep down, even he didn't believe his own words. The young geologist suggested stopping the drilling and focusing on observation instead. She said the vibrations were too consistent to be natural accidents. But before they could decide anything, one of the villagers arrived at the camp with two others. Their faces were pale and serious. The oldest among them spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You've gone too far," he said. "The mountain is not a mountain. It's the resting place of something that once walked the earth. You've disturbed its sleep." The engineers exchanged uneasy looks. One of them tried to reason with the old man, explaining that what they heard was only geological pressure. But the villager shook his head. "Pressure does not breathe," he said quietly. Then he pointed toward the hill. "You will hear it again tonight." After he left, everyone was silent. Even the most skeptical among them felt uneasy. The night came colder than usual. The wind died down completely. Around midnight, the ground began to hum again. The same slow, rhythmic vibration, stronger now than before. The sound seemed to come from all around them, not from one direction. It filled the air, the tents, the soil beneath their feet. Some people covered their ears, but it didn't help. It wasn't just a noise. It was a feeling, a deep, heavy pulse that traveled through the chest like a second heartbeat. Then suddenly it stopped. The silence that followed was even more frightening. The ground was still, but the air felt alive, charged with energy. The young geologist checked her instruments and gasped. The vibrations had formed a perfect repeating pattern, almost like a coded rhythm. It didn't look random at all. She copied the pattern in her notebook and stared at it for a long time. It reminded her of something she had seen once, an old drawing carved into a stone in a museum. showing the shape of waves rising from a giant lying beneath the mountains. The next day, the valley looked different. Small cracks had appeared on the slopes, running like veins through the soil. The trees nearest to the drilling site leaned slightly, as if pulled toward the center of the hill. The villagers refused to come near now. They stayed in their homes, leaving food and candles outside their doors, old offerings from forgotten rituals. The team began to argue among themselves. Some wanted to report the phenomenon and leave immediately. Others insisted it was just natural movement and that they could still finish the job. The pressure from the higher authorities didn't help. They wanted progress, not legends. By evening, the young geologist sat alone near the edge of the valley, staring at the hill. The sun was setting and the light made the mound glow with a strange golden hue. For a moment, she thought she saw the surface of the ground shift slightly like a muscle tightening under skin. She blinked and rubbed her eyes, but the feeling wouldn't go away. She whispered softly to herself, "It's breathing again." As darkness covered the valley, the sounds returned, faint at first, then deeper. The earth beneath the camp vibrated once more, this time more powerful. A few stones rolled down from the hillside. The instruments went wild, their needles swinging out of control. The project head shouted for everyone to move away from the drilling area. The noise grew louder, then suddenly stopped again in a sharp, unnatural silence. Everyone stood frozen. The night air was still, too still. Not even the crickets sang. In that heavy quiet, the young geologist's voice broke softly through the air. "We're not studying the earth anymore. We're standing on something that's alive." No one replied. But deep down, everyone knew she was right. The vibrations, the heat, the strange sounds, none of it matched science. It was as if the ground itself was warning them, telling them to leave. And yet, the next morning, despite the fear and confusion, the team stayed. They told themselves they were chasing knowledge. But the truth was simpler. They were curious. And that curiosity was stronger than fear. As they packed up their tools for another day of work, the villagers watched from a distance. The old man who had warned them before stood at the edge of the path, shaking his head. He knew what they did not, that once the earth begins to move in rhythm, it never stops until it wakes completely. And somewhere deep below, in the dark silence of the buried hill, something ancient shifted again, a slow, heavy movement that no one could see, but everyone could feel. The Earthborn Colossus was not awake yet, but it was no longer sleeping peacefully. Morning came quietly, but the air in the valley felt heavier than usual. The sunlight, which once gave warmth and peace, now seemed dim and pale, filtered through a thin layer of mist that had settled overnight. The drilling camp looked like a battlefield of confusion. Tools scattered, equipment half buried in dust, and faces tired from sleepless nights. No one said much at breakfast. Everyone kept glancing at the hill as if waiting for it to move again. When the sun rose higher, they noticed something strange. A long, thin crack ran across the valley floor, right where the drilling site ended. It wasn't there the day before. It started from the base of the hill and stretched toward the small river that flowed near the camp. The ground on both sides looked slightly raised, as though something underneath was pushing upward. The workers stood around it silently. One of them bent down and put his hand near the crack. The air coming out of it was warm. He pulled back quickly, staring at it in disbelief. "The ground's breathing," he whispered. The project head tried to keep everyone calm. He told them it was just pressure release, natural movement caused by the drilling. But his voice didn't sound convincing, not even to himself. The young geologist, who had been keeping notes since the first tremor, looked closely at the crack. It wasn't random. It moved in a curved line, like the outline of something buried beneath the surface. She marked the path of the crack on her map and realized something chilling. The line formed a half circle around the hill, like the edge of a massive buried shape. Her hands trembled as she traced it again, making sure she wasn't imagining things. It was clear now. The hill wasn't just a mound of earth. It was covering something enormous. By afternoon, the villagers came again, this time staying far from the camp. They didn't shout or argue. They just watched quietly from a distance. The older ones stood with folded hands, whispering words of warning or prayer. They didn't need to say anything more. The look in their eyes was enough to show fear, not for themselves, but for the people who refused to listen. The young geologist wanted to stop the project immediately. She spoke with the project head, showing him the map, the data, and her theory that something massive, maybe ancient, was buried under the hill. "We don't know what it is," she said softly, "but the land is reacting to us." "It's not just rock," the project head sighed. "You're talking about legends again," he said. "We have no proof, only stories." But deep down he wasn't as confident as he sounded. Even his rational mind couldn't explain the tremors, the heat, or the rhythmic vibrations. That night the wind picked up again. The trees swayed and groaned as if whispering secrets to each other. The sky was clear, but the moonlight felt strange, colder, almost silvery. Around midnight, a deep rumble rolled through the valley. It wasn't a violent shake, but it was long and steady. Everyone in the camp woke up. The young geologist stepped outside, clutching her flashlight. She looked toward the hill and froze. The crack from earlier had widened. Soil and stones had fallen away, revealing something underneath. A surface too smooth and pale to be earth. She walked closer, her heart pounding. The texture looked almost like carved stone, curved and massive. When she touched it lightly, it was warm, like the ground had life flowing inside it. The rest of the team soon joined her, their flashlights bouncing across the strange surface. Someone whispered, "It's not rock." Another added, "It's shaped, like a shoulder." No one said a word after that. They just stood there, staring at the enormous shape buried beneath them, half exposed by the widening cracks. By morning, the story had spread across the village. Some said the sleeping giant was waking up. Others said it was punishment for disturbing sacred land. A few younger villagers wanted to see for themselves, but the elders stopped them, warning, "This is not for human eyes." The government, too, had been alerted by now. A message was sent to the city, and a new team was supposed to arrive in a few days. But the earth didn't wait for them. It had its own rhythm. On the second night, the tremors returned, and stronger this time. The entire camp shook. Boxes fell, tools scattered, and one of the floodlights toppled over. The workers ran outside shouting for help, but no one knew what to do. The ground split open a little more, the cracks spreading like lightning across the valley floor. The villagers could see the lights flickering from afar. Some began ringing bells and lighting fires on the hillsides, believing it would calm the sleeping spirit beneath the earth. Inside the camp, chaos turned into fear. The project head tried to contact the main office on the radio, but the signal was gone. The young geologist, instead of running, kept her eyes on the ground. She noticed something unbelievable. The tremors weren't random anymore. They came in a slow, repeating rhythm, like the steady beat of a gigantic heart. She whispered to herself, "It's breathing again." The sound grew deeper, and the ground under her feet seemed to move like a wave. She fell to her knees, clutching the soil. For a brief second, she felt as though something enormous was shifting far beneath her, not violently but deliberately, like a creature stretching in its sleep after a long rest. When the shaking stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than any sound. The whole valley went still. Even the river seemed to flow more quietly, as if afraid to disturb whatever lay below. The next morning, they discovered that the hill had changed shape slightly. It had risen only by a few inches, but enough to notice. The villagers refused to come anywhere near now. They believed the sleeping one was no longer just dreaming. It was stirring. The young geologist couldn't take her eyes off the map she'd drawn earlier. The cracks now perfectly outlined what looked like a massive form, a torso, an arm, maybe even a head beneath the earth. It was impossible, but her scientific mind could find no other explanation. As the sun set that evening, a strange stillness fell again. The sky turned red and the air grew warmer. The team sat together, exhausted and shaken. One of the older workers spoke quietly. "Maybe we should leave. Maybe some things aren't meant to be touched." No one argued. They all felt the same. But leaving wasn't easy. Their trucks were low on fuel, and the nearest town was miles away through rocky terrain. They decided to wait until morning. Late that night, as everyone tried to rest, the young geologist woke suddenly. A faint humming sound filled the air. Not from machines, not from wind, but from the ground itself. She stepped out of her tent and followed the sound toward the hill. The surface where the crack had opened was glowing faintly. Not bright, but enough to be visible under the moonlight. Her breath caught in her throat. She moved closer, heart pounding, and saw the surface shifting again, the same slow rise and fall like breathing. The glow pulsed with it, fading and brightening in rhythm. She stood there frozen, unable to move. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The earth itself seemed alive, old, powerful, and aware. Suddenly a gust of wind rushed down the valley, almost knocking her back. The light faded instantly and the hum stopped. She stayed there for a long moment, staring into the darkness, knowing she had just witnessed something beyond explanation. The next morning, she told the others what she saw. Some believed her. Others thought it was exhaustion. But when they went to the site together, they found the ground warm again, as if it had held the glow through the night. The project head finally made his decision. "We're stopping everything," he said firmly. "We'll wait for the city team to arrive. No more drilling." Relief washed over some of them, but for others it was too late. The feeling in the valley had changed. The land wasn't still anymore. It felt like something beneath was listening. As the sun set that day, the villagers packed their belongings and began moving toward the lower plains. They said they would return only when the mountain slept again. The valley grew quiet. Too quiet. That night, as darkness took over, a faint sound rolled through the earth once more. Not a quake, not a roar, but a deep, steady breath. It was calm, patient, ancient. The young geologist stood outside her tent and whispered to herself, "It's not done yet." Far below the ground, buried under centuries of stone and soil, something vast shifted again. A slow, deliberate motion that sent ripples through the valley floor. The cracks spread wider, tracing the outline of something enormous that waited, silent but awake. The Earthborn Colossus was still stirring, slowly, steadily, as if remembering what it once was. The sun rose behind a curtain of pale clouds that morning. The air in the valley felt heavy, thick, and strangely still. It was the kind of stillness that made even birds go quiet. The team packed their tools and prepared to wait for the city officials to arrive. The drilling had stopped completely, but the feeling of unease hadn't gone away. It was growing stronger with every hour. The young geologist kept checking her instruments. The data didn't make sense anymore. The ground beneath the hill seemed to be moving on its own. The pattern wasn't random, not like an earthquake. It was slow and pulsing, as if something deep under the soil was alive and breathing. By noon, the villagers were gone. The last few families left quietly, walking along the rocky path toward the lower plains. Only the team remained now, their camp standing alone beside the silent hill. Even the wind had stopped blowing through the trees. It was unnaturally quiet. That evening, dark clouds began to gather over the valley. The air grew colder, and a faint humming sound filled the space between the mountains. The team sat together in the tent, the lantern flickering in the dim light. They didn't talk much. Everyone was lost in thought, wondering if the strange things they had seen were real or just their imagination. Suddenly, the ground trembled. It was soft at first, like the earth sighing beneath their feet. Then came a low rumble that rolled through the valley like a wave. The lantern shook on the table, spilling its light across their faces. They froze, waiting for it to stop, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, deeper, as if something massive was moving below. The tremor became a steady rhythm, a series of thuds like a heartbeat echoing through the ground. The team rushed outside, flashlights in hand, scanning the hill in front of them. The cracks that had appeared earlier were glowing faintly again, spreading slowly like veins of dim light. The soil around them shifted, sending small stones tumbling down. The young geologist stared wide-eyed. "It's moving again," she whispered. The sky darkened. Thunder rolled in the distance, though no lightning followed. The air itself seemed to vibrate. A deep resonant sound, half roar, half groan, echoed from beneath the hill, shaking the air and ground alike. It was so powerful that everyone dropped to their knees, covering their ears. It wasn't the sound of breaking rock or rushing water. It was something alive, a sound that felt like it came from the very bones of the earth. The vibrations made the camp lights flicker, and the nearby river churned violently, splashing against its banks. Then just as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. Silence filled the valley again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that followed after something immense had taken its first breath in centuries. No one spoke for a long time. Some of the workers were shaking, others staring blankly at the ground. The young geologist finally stood up and said softly, This isn't a natural movement. It's not an earthquake. It's something waking up. The project head didn't argue. He couldn't. His rational mind had no explanation anymore. The instruments, the cracks, the sounds, everything pointed to one impossible truth. That night, the team didn't sleep. They gathered around the campfire, watching the hill. The flames flickered nervously as if reacting to the strange energy in the air. The earth beneath them would occasionally shudder, small, soft, but constant. Like the mountain was breathing slowly in its sleep. Around midnight, a bright flash lit up the sky, though there was no thunder this time. It wasn't lightning, it was something else. For a brief second, the entire hill glowed faintly from beneath, revealing faint outlines under the soil, curved lines, huge shapes, and patterns that looked almost like carvings. Everyone gasped. The young geologist took a step forward, trying to understand what she was seeing. The ground shimmered again, and then just as quickly the light vanished. The valley fell into darkness once more. "Did you see that?" one of the workers whispered. No one answered. But they all had. The rest of the night passed slowly. The air felt alive, like the whole valley was holding its breath. Some of the team tried to pack, but the trucks wouldn't start. The fuel tanks were full, the engines fine, yet they refused to work. It was as if the earth itself didn't want them to leave. By early morning, the clouds cleared, revealing a sky too bright and too still. The young geologist walked toward the hill again, her notebook in hand. She could see where the cracks had widened overnight. The soil was sinking slightly in the middle, as if the ground itself was caving in around something enormous. She knelt and placed her hand on the ground. It was warm again, not like before, but warmer, almost pulsing beneath her palm. She closed her eyes and felt it. The rhythm was slow and strong, like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. She whispered to herself, "It's not just the earth. It's a living thing." Suddenly, a deep vibration shook the valley again. The ground cracked wider and a loud sound echoed, a sound like a massive sigh. The team rushed to her side, shouting for her to move away. The soil beneath her feet began to crumble, and she stumbled back just in time. The hill's surface started to split. Dust rose into the air as chunks of earth rolled down the slopes. Everyone watched in disbelief as the top of the hill seemed to shift slightly, as if something enormous inside was turning over. The sound that followed was deafening. Not a roar, not thunder, but something in between. It was a deep, echoing call that rattled the bones and vibrated in their chests. The camp shook violently. The tents fell. Tools clattered across the ground. The river beside the camp overflowed, splashing mud and stones into the valley. And then, silence again. When the dust settled, everyone stood staring at the hill. The top part had collapsed slightly, revealing a strange, smooth surface underneath. It wasn't just rock. It had patterns, lines that looked like carvings, spirals, and symbols no one could understand. The young geologist stared at it for a long moment. "It's like a giant sculpture," she whispered. "But it's warm." One of the workers touched the surface and pulled his hand back instantly. "It's alive," he muttered, eyes wide. The project head stepped forward slowly, unsure what to say. The logical part of his mind kept searching for an explanation, maybe an ancient structure, a volcanic heat pocket, or mineral reaction. But none of it fit. What they were looking at was beyond anything science could explain. That night no one slept again. The air was thick, electric, full of pressure. The sound of the ground shifting continued, soft but constant. Some of the team began packing whatever they could carry. Others simply sat near the fire, staring at the glowing cracks. Around 3 a.m, the hum returned, louder than ever. The ground began to move again, slowly but powerfully. The earth rose and fell, as though something beneath was pushing upward. The cracks expanded and the sound deepened until it became a rumble that could be felt more than heard. And then, through the thick dust and rising soil, they saw it. A massive shape beneath the collapsing hill. Moving just slightly, it wasn't fast or sudden. It was slow and deliberate, like something awakening after an endless sleep. A faint light shimmered from the cracks, illuminating the valley in ghostly silver. Everyone stood frozen. Some were terrified, others speechless. The young geologist, barely able to breathe, whispered, "It's waking up." The ground trembled once more, sending waves through the valley. The sound that followed was unlike anything human, deep, ancient, and full of weight. It wasn't angry. It wasn't kind either. It was simply there, the voice of something that had existed long before humans came to this land. When it stopped, everything went quiet again. The dust settled, the light faded, and the valley stood still. The hill had changed shape completely now, no longer a perfect mound but broken and uneven. In the center, the faint outline of what looked like a gigantic arm was visible beneath the soil, curled tightly into the earth. No one spoke. No one moved. The young geologist turned to the others, her voice trembling. "We can't stay here anymore." The project head nodded slowly. "No," he said quietly. "We were never meant to." They packed whatever they could, though most of their equipment was damaged or buried. As the first light of dawn touched the valley, they began their slow walk toward the lower plains. None of them looked back. Behind them, the valley was silent once more. The air was thick with dust and mystery, but if one listened closely, very closely, they could still hear it. A low, steady hum beneath the ground. Not angry, not peaceful, just alive. The Earthborn Colossus had stirred again, not fully awake but not asleep anymore, and though the people left the valley, the sound of that night would never leave their hearts. They had heard the voice of the earth itself, a reminder that some things are better left buried. The valley lay in silence after the team left, but that silence was not peace. It was waiting. The air had changed. The soil was no longer still, and even the trees seemed to lean away from the hill, as if nature itself knew that something beneath had started to move. The group traveled down the rocky trail, their clothes covered in dust, their faces pale with exhaustion. No one spoke much. They had seen something they couldn't explain, something that didn't belong to the world they understood. The young geologist kept glancing back, though she couldn't see the hill anymore. Still, she could feel it, that low hum that had followed them all night. It was weaker now, but it was there, like a heartbeat echoing faintly beneath her feet. By the time they reached the small town at the edge of the valley, the sun had already set. The locals gathered around them, asking what had happened. The team tried to explain, but the words felt useless. How could anyone believe that the earth itself had moved like a living being? Some laughed nervously, others looked frightened. A few of the older villagers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. They had heard stories, old tales passed down through generations, stories about something sleeping beneath the hills, something that must never be disturbed. That night, the team stayed in a small guest house. The young geologist couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring toward the dark line of mountains in the distance. Even from there, she felt a strange pressure in the air, like the valley was still breathing. She opened her notebook and began to write about the cracks, the sounds, the heat, the movement, everything she remembered. She didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but she needed to record it while the memory was still fresh. As she wrote, the lights in the room flickered for a moment. She looked up. The air grew colder, and the glass on the window trembled slightly. She stood up slowly, heart pounding. The vibrations were faint but unmistakable, the same rhythmic pulse she had felt on the hill. She pressed her hand against the wall. The faint humming came again, distant but real. It was like the valley itself was reaching out to remind her it hadn't forgotten them. By morning, everyone in town had heard it too. The ground had shaken lightly just before dawn, waking people from their sleep. A few thought it was an aftershock from the drilling, others said it was thunder. But those who had lived near the valley for decades knew better. They said it was a warning. The project head contacted the authorities, trying to explain what they had witnessed, but no one believed him. Officials dismissed it as panic, saying it was just geological instability caused by over-drilling. They promised to send a team to investigate, but the older villagers begged them not to. They said the land had been restless for a reason, that something sacred had been disturbed. Some even packed their belongings, planning to leave the area for good. 2 days later, heavy rain began to fall. The valley disappeared under thick mist and storm clouds. The investigation team never arrived. Roads were blocked by landslides and communication signals were weak. It felt as if the valley had sealed itself off from the outside world. The young geologist couldn't rest. She felt responsible. She had been the first to sense that something was wrong, but no one had stopped the drilling in time. Now the valley was changing and she couldn't ignore it. She decided to go back, not to stay, but to see. She needed to know if what she felt was real or just her imagination. Early one morning, before the rain cleared, she packed her small bag, took a flashlight, and started walking toward the valley again. The project head tried to stop her, but she said softly, "I need to understand. If I don't go, I'll never sleep again." The path was slippery, covered with mud and fallen branches. The closer she got to the valley, the heavier the air became. It was like walking into a place that no longer belonged to the world of humans. When she reached the edge, the sight took her breath away. The hill had changed completely. It wasn't smooth anymore. It looked torn apart as if a giant hand had pushed through it from below. Massive cracks stretched across the valley floor, glowing faintly even under the daylight. She could hear it too, that deep, slow rhythm. It wasn't loud, but it filled the air around her. It was alive. She walked closer, her boots sinking into the soft ground. The air smelled strange, earthy, metallic, and ancient. Each step made the vibration stronger. It wasn't random anymore. It followed a pattern, almost like a call. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her shuddered. She fell to her knees, clutching the soil. A low rumble rolled through the valley, louder than before. She looked up and her eyes widened in shock. The center of the hill, the same place where they had seen strange carvings before, began to shift. The earth cracked open with a thunderous sound, sending rocks flying in all directions. The soil fell away, revealing the dark, massive surface beneath. It wasn't just stone. It was something else. Smooth, curved, and impossibly large. The light from the cracks grew brighter, spreading like fire through the ground. The air buzzed with energy. The rain fell harder, but it couldn't drown out the sound rising from below. And then, through the thick mist and glowing dust, something began to rise. It wasn't fast, and it was slow, steady, like the earth itself was stretching after an endless slumber. The ground trembled with each movement. The young geologist backed away, her eyes wide, unable to believe what she was seeing. A shape emerged, not fully clear, but massive. It looked like a colossal figure made of stone and soil, its surface covered in moss and roots. Its movements were heavy, deliberate, like a creature waking from centuries of sleep. The Earthborn Colossus had awakened. The rain turned into a storm, lightning flashing across the sky. The ground split further as the giant form continued to rise. Trees fell, rocks rolled down, and the valley shook violently. The young geologist stumbled back, shielding her face from the wind and dust. Her flashlight fell, rolling into the mud, but she didn't run. She couldn't. She was frozen, both terrified and amazed. The giant's eyes opened slowly, glowing with a deep, earthy light. It didn't look human, but it wasn't just rock either. It was something between life and earth, ancient beyond imagination. It raised its massive head, and for a brief moment, it looked toward the sky, not with anger but with confusion, as if trying to remember where it was. Then it turned slightly, the ground shaking under its weight. The young geologist felt the vibration in her bones. The sound it made wasn't a roar. It was deeper, older, like the voice of the planet itself. The storm seemed to respond. The rain poured harder, the wind howled, and lightning struck the hills around them. The Colossus began to move, slowly walking toward the river, each step leaving deep marks in the earth. It didn't destroy everything in its path, but every movement changed the land, bending trees, shifting rocks, reshaping the valley as if the world itself was being rewritten. The young geologist realized it wasn't attacking. It wasn't even aware of them. It was just, "Awake," she whispered. "It's not our enemy. It's just alive." But the earth didn't stop trembling. The movement was spreading far beyond the valley. She could see hills in the distance shaking, dust rising into the air. The awakening of the Colossus had disturbed the balance of the land itself. She knew then that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The rain eased slightly, and she took one last look at the giant form before running back toward the path. Behind her, the Earthborn Colossus stood tall in the mist, unmoving but alive, its eyes glowing faintly through the fog. When she reached the town, she collapsed near the gates, covered in mud and rainwater. The others rushed to her side, trying to help. She looked up at them, her voice shaking. "It's real," she whispered. "It's alive, and it's awake now." The town fell silent. No one spoke. The distant rumble of the earth continued to echo faintly, soft, slow, but endless. Everyone felt it. The world had changed. Something ancient had returned. Something older than humanity, stronger than steel, and deeper than time itself. The Earthborn Colossus was no longer sleeping beneath the ground. It was awake, and the earth would never be the same again. The valley was no longer silent. The whole land seemed to be breathing again, slow, deep, and alive. After the awakening of the Earthborn Colossus, nothing felt the same. The air carried a strange energy, and the ground beneath the people's feet seemed to hum quietly, as if the world itself had gained a heartbeat. The young geologist sat by the window of the small guest house, staring out at the mist-covered mountains. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a cup of tea, but her eyes never left the horizon. It had been 2 days since she had returned from the valley, and still the ground would shake every few hours. Not enough to cause damage, but enough to remind everyone that something enormous was alive beneath them. The townspeople were frightened. Some packed their bags and left for safer places. Others prayed or stayed inside, hoping it would stop on its own. But deep inside, everyone knew whatever had awakened under that hill was far beyond their understanding or control. The young geologist couldn't forget the sight she had seen. The massive figure rising from the soil, the light that glowed from its eyes, and the feeling that the earth itself was watching her. It hadn't felt like a monster. It had felt like a guardian, old and forgotten, confused by what it saw after waking from a sleep that had lasted longer than history itself. That night she gathered the few remaining members of her team. They sat together in the dim light of a small cafe, their faces pale and tired. No one wanted to speak first. Finally, the project head looked up and said softly, "It's still there, isn't it?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, it hasn't gone back to sleep." Another team member asked, "What does it want?" She looked down at her hands. "I don't think it wants anything from us. It's just awake, and the world is trying to adjust." Outside, thunder rolled softly across the mountains. The rain hadn't stopped since that night. It was as if the sky, too, was restless. The next morning, a faint news report reached the town. Strange tremors were being felt in nearby regions as well. Rivers were shifting course. Old trees had fallen without reason, and strange lights were being seen from mountaintops. The world around them was changing piece by piece. The young geologist knew she had to return to the valley one last time. Not for research or proof, but to understand what message the land was trying to give. As she walked toward the valley again, the clouds began to break, and thin rays of sunlight spilled through. The path that had once been full of life now looked different, quiet, untouched, and sacred. The birds didn't sing here anymore. The trees stood still as if guarding something ancient. When she reached the edge, the sight before her made her heart race. The hill, or what was left of it, had changed completely. The shape of the Colossus was now visible, half buried, half free, resting in a seated position as though it had chosen to stop moving. Its body looked like a mountain itself, covered in roots and moss, blending perfectly with the earth. Its eyes, once glowing, were now dim but not lifeless. They shimmered faintly as if still aware. The valley around it had turned green again. The cracked soil was now soft with grass, and the air smelled clean and wet. The river flowed smoothly once more, as though nature had found a new rhythm. She stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. The Colossus wasn't destroying anything. It was healing what had been disturbed. It was then she understood. The Colossus wasn't a monster or a curse. It was part of the Earth's balance. The drilling, the noise, the greed, all of it had broken a harmony that had lasted for centuries. The awakening was not an attack. It was a reaction. She whispered to herself. We woke it up because we forgot how to listen. As she stood near the edge, the ground beneath her vibrated softly again, not in anger, but gently, like a response. She felt warmth spread under her feet. It was almost comforting. For a moment she closed her eyes and let the feeling wash over her. It was as if the Colossus could sense her presence, recognize that she understood now. Behind her, the clouds began to move aside. A soft beam of sunlight fell directly on the Colossus's head, lighting up its moss-covered surface. It looked peaceful, ancient and wise, like the soul of the earth itself resting after a long awakening. The young geologist knew that no one would ever truly believe her story. People would call it a myth or a natural illusion. Scientists would search for logic and governments would cover it with reports and silence. But she didn't care anymore. She had seen it. The truth that the Earth was not just rock and dirt but alive in ways humans had long forgotten. Days passed, and the tremors began to fade. Life in the nearby town slowly returned to normal. The villagers started coming back, planting crops again, repairing homes. Yet none of them dared to step into the valley. They treated it like a sacred place now, quiet, untouched, and respected. One morning she returned again, just once more. She walked to the same spot where she had first felt the heartbeat beneath her hand. The ground was calm now, cool and soft. She smiled faintly and placed her hand on the earth again. It didn't tremble. But she could still feel something, a faint pulse, distant yet steady. It was like a gentle promise that the world was still alive, still watching and still forgiving. She whispered softly, "We won't forget this time." A soft breeze passed through the valley, carrying the scent of wet soil and blooming flowers. It almost felt like the earth itself was answering her. A sigh of relief, maybe even a thank you. She stood there until the sun was high, her heart calm for the first time in weeks. Then she turned and walked away, knowing she would never return again. The Earthborn Colossus remained where it was, silent, peaceful, half buried in its ancient cradle. The cracks around it slowly filled with grass and water. The valley began to flourish again as though reborn. Years later, people still spoke about the event in hushed voices. Some called it a miracle, others a warning, but no one dared to disturb the land again. The valley became known as a place of balance, a reminder that the earth had its own ways of protecting itself when pushed too far. The young geologist moved far away and started a quiet life. Yet every time she stood near a river or felt the rain or saw the way mountains stood silently under the sky, she remembered that valley. Sometimes she would close her eyes and swear she could still hear it, that slow, deep heartbeat of the earth beneath her feet. It didn't scare her anymore. Instead, it gave her peace, a feeling that she was connected to something vast and eternal. She never published her findings, never wrote a book, never sought fame. Some stories, she believed, were not meant for headlines or awards. Some were meant to be carried quietly, like a secret between the earth and those who listen. And so the Earthborn Colossus slept again, not in silence, but in harmony. The land healed, the rivers flowed, and the valley became a place of calm beauty. No one saw it move again. But sometimes when the wind blew just right or when the rain fell heavy on the soil, the faint humming could still be heard, a soft reminder that the guardian beneath the hills was still there, watching, waiting, and protecting the world it had once helped create. The people learned to live with that sound, no longer afraid. It became part of their lives, a quiet song of the earth. Children grew up hearing tales about the great being beneath the ground, not as a monster, but as a guardian who once woke to save the land from human carelessness. And in that story lived a message, a reminder that the earth, though vast and silent, feels everything we do. It breathes, it remembers, and sometimes, when pushed too far, it speaks. That was the truth the young geologist carried with her until the end of her life. She had heard the voice of the planet, and she had understood. The Earthborn Colossus had stirred once, not to destroy, but to remind the world to listen again. And when it returned to its eternal rest, the world above continued, a little wiser, a little humbler, and far more aware of the living earth beneath their feet.